Colorado Territory, 1872. The snowmelt cascaded down from the Rocky Mountains, feeding the swollen creeks that cut through the valley. The small settlement of Pinewood hadn't seen a new face in months, which was precisely why Ethan Caldwell had chosen it. A frontier was a place where a man could disappear, or at least that's what he'd come to believe after 3 years of drifting from town to town, never lingering long enough to cast a shadow. A man who stays gets buried, his father had told him before dying with his boots on, shot down over a card game in Dodge City. It was a lesson Ethan carried like the Colt revolver at his hip, close and ready. At 25, his handsome face remained unlined despite the harsh sun that had bronzed his skin, but his eyes told a different story. They carried the wariness of someone much older, someone who'd learned that attachment was a luxury the West didn't afford. Ethan dismounted from his dun-colored gelding outside the town's only hotel, a 2-story wooden structure that looked sturdy enough to withstand the mountain winters. His muscles ached from 3 days in the saddle, and the prospect of a real bed, even if only for a night, was enough to loosen the permanent knot between his shoulder blades. Just passing through, he muttered to himself, a reminder of his own code. 3 days maximum. Enough time to resupply, maybe earn a few dollars breaking horses if anyone needed the help, and then back to the trail before anyone learned his name or worse, tried to make him stay. The hotel's front door swung open as a woman stepped out onto the porch, her arms full of freshly laundered linens. The April sunlight caught in her honey-blonde hair, which was pinned up but threatened to escape its confines. She wore a simple blue calico dress with small white flowers, practical but somehow more striking than the elaborate gowns he'd seen on saloon girls in Denver. "Oh," she exclaimed, nearly dropping her bundle as she noticed him standing there. "I didn't see you." "My apologies, ma'am," Ethan said, removing his hat. "Didn't mean to startle you." Her eyes, the clear blue of a Colorado sky, assessed him with a frankness uncommon in proper ladies. She couldn't have been more than 22, but there was a self-possession about her that spoke of someone who'd weathered hardship. "You're looking for a room, I imagine," she said, shifting the linens to one arm and extending her right hand. "Victoria Lawson, this is my father's hotel." Ethan hesitated before taking her hand, unaccustomed to such forward behavior from a woman. Her palm was warm and slightly rough, working hands, not a lady's soft touch. Ethan Caldwell. "Yes, ma'am, just for a night or two." "I'm just passing through," the cowboy said, but her smile made him want to stay. It was a simple gesture, that smile, revealing a small dimple in her left cheek. Nothing extraordinary except for how it seemed to reach into Ethan's chest and stir something he'd long thought dead, a dangerous feeling he immediately tried to smother. "Well, Mr. Caldwell," Victoria said, "passing through or not, you've arrived on a fortunate day. We've got stew tonight and Mrs. Hanson just delivered fresh bread." Before Ethan could respond, a commotion erupted from the general store across the dusty street. A man's angry voice rose above the normal afternoon sounds, followed by the unmistakable crash of breaking glass. Victoria's smile vanished. "That's the 3rd time this week," she murmured, almost to herself. "Trouble?" Ethan asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "The new mining company men," she explained tersely. "They've been pressuring everyone to sell their claims. Some are less polite about it than others." She straightened her shoulders. "But that's not your concern, Mr. Caldwell. Come inside and I'll get you settled." As she turned toward the door, Ethan caught himself watching the determined set of her shoulders, the graceful line of her neck. It was a dangerous distraction for a man who lived by staying alert, by remaining unattached. Just passing through, he reminded himself firmly. But even as he followed Victoria into the hotel, something inside him whispered that 3 days might not be enough this time. The hotel's interior was surprisingly well appointed for a frontier establishment. Polished wooden floors, actual curtains on the windows, and a large stone fireplace that dominated the small lobby spoke of care and permanence, 2 things Ethan had consciously avoided since burying his father. "My father built this place 10 years ago," Victoria explained as she moved behind the front desk. "When the silver strike first brought people to the valley, he said that even miners deserved a civilized place to sleep." She pulled a registry book toward her. "Most are gone now, moved on to the next big strike, but we're still here." "Your father around?" Ethan asked, signing his name in the book. A shadow passed across Victoria's face. "No, he's indisposed, has been since winter. Doctor says it's his heart." Ethan nodded, not pressing further. Everyone in the West carried their burdens. It wasn't his place to inquire about hers. Sorry to hear it. Room 4 is available, Victoria said, changing the subject as she handed him a key. Second floor, end of the hall. Best view in the house. She hesitated, then added, dinner's at 6 if you're interested. Otherwise, there's the saloon down the street. Much obliged, Ethan replied, taking the key. Their fingers brushed momentarily, and he found himself oddly reluctant to break the contact. That night, Ethan surprised himself by choosing the hotel dining room over the saloon. He told himself it was the promise of home cooking rather than the prospect of seeing Victoria Lawson again, but even he didn't quite believe the lie. She served the meal herself, moving between the 4 occupied tables with efficiency and grace. The stew was hearty, filled with chunks of venison and root vegetables, and the bread was still warm. It was the best meal Ethan had eaten in months. Will you be needing work while you're here? Victoria asked as she refilled his coffee cup. Mr. Daniels lost his wrangler last month. He's got a string of Mustangs needs breaking. I might inquire, Ethan replied noncommittally, though I'm not looking to stay long. Victoria's gaze was direct, unflinching. Most aren't, though some find reasons to change their minds. Before Ethan could respond, the hotel's front door banged open. 3 men entered, their boots leaving mud tracks on Victoria's clean floor. They wore city clothes, Eastern-cut suits that looked out of place in a frontier town, but carried themselves with the arrogant swagger of men accustomed to using their fists. Miss Lawson, the tallest one, called out, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Lovely as ever, we've come to speak with your father. Victoria's spine stiffened. As I told you yesterday, Mr. Reed, my father is unwell and not receiving visitors. This isn't a social call, Reed replied, his smile thinning. This is business. Mountain Valley Mining has made a fair offer for this property. The deadline for acceptance is tomorrow. And as my father told you last month, the Pinewood Hotel is not for sale. Victoria's voice remained level, but Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly as she set down the coffee pot. Reed took a step forward, close enough that Victoria had to tilt her chin up to maintain eye contact. Things happen to businesses that don't cooperate with progress, Miss Lawson. Accidents, fires. It would be a shame to see your father's hard work go up in smoke because of stubbornness. Ethan was on his feet before he'd made the conscious decision to move. The lady said her father isn't receiving visitors, he said quietly, positioning himself between Victoria and Reed. I believe that concludes your business here. Reed's eyes narrowed as he assessed Ethan, taking in the worn but well-maintained gun belt, the quiet confidence of a man who knew how to use it. His companions shifted uneasily. And who might you be? Reed demanded. Someone who appreciates good hospitality, Ethan replied evenly, and good manners. For a tense moment, Ethan thought Reed might escalate the confrontation. Then the man laughed, a sound without humor. Well, the Lawsons have found themselves a guard dog. He settled his hat back on his head. No matter, our offer stands until noon tomorrow. After that, we can't be responsible for what happens. When the door closed behind the 3 men, Ethan became acutely aware of Victoria standing close beside him, the faint scent of lavender rising from her hair. You shouldn't have done that, she said, but there was no reproach in her voice, only concern. Those men are dangerous. I've encountered worse, Ethan replied, trying to ignore how her proximity affected him. Victoria studied his face. Yes, she said softly, I believe you have. She hesitated, then added, Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Not many passing through would involve themselves in local troubles. Ethan, he corrected her, surprising himself. If I'm going to make enemies on your behalf, you might as well use my given name. Her smile returned, warming her eyes. Victoria, then, thou most call me Torai. She glanced toward the window, where Reed and his companions could be seen crossing toward the saloon. I should check on my father. He worries when he hears raised voices. Ethan nodded, suddenly reluctant to end their conversation. Is there anything I can do? The question hung between them, offering more than assistance with mining company thugs. It was the first time in years Ethan had made such an offer to anyone, and the realization unsettled him. Victoria hesitated. Just stay a little longer than you planned, please, at least until this business with Mountain Valley is resolved. It was a request that contradicted everything Ethan had lived by since his father's death. Staying meant involvement. Involvement meant vulnerability, and in his experience, vulnerability in the West was just another word for dead. Yet looking into Victoria's determined face, Ethan found himself nodding. "I'll speak with Daniels in the morning. See about those horses." The relief in her eyes was payment enough, even as a voice in the back of his mind warned him he'd just made a dangerous bargain. The next morning, Ethan rode out to the Daniels ranch at dawn. Frank Daniels, a weathered man in his 50s, sized Ethan up with one look and handed him a rope. "Got 12 Mustangs need gentling," he said without preamble. "Pays $4 a head plus room and board if you need it. Can you start today?" By noon, Ethan had earned Daniels' respect and his first $8 by successfully backing two of the wildest horses in the string. The work was exactly what he needed, physically demanding enough to exhaust his body and requiring enough concentration to quiet his mind, which kept wandering to honey-blonde hair and a dimpled smile. He returned to town as the sun was setting, dusty and saddle-sore, but with a sense of satisfaction he hadn't felt in months. The hotel seemed unusually quiet as he approached, and a prickle of unease ran down his spine when he saw the front door standing partially open. Inside, the lobby was empty, but he could hear raised voices from the rear of the building. Following the sound, Ethan found Victoria in what appeared to be a small private sitting room, standing protectively in front of a frail-looking older man propped up in an armchair. Reed and his two companions blocked the exit. "The deadline has passed, Miss Lawson," Reed was saying, "yet we've received no acceptance of our offer." "Because we've declined it," Victoria replied firmly, "as we've told you repeatedly." The older man, clearly Victoria's father, struggled to sit upright. "My daughter speaks for me in this matter, Reed. The hotel stays in the family. Now get out of my house." Reed's face darkened. "That's unfortunate. Especially given your condition, Mr. Lawson. A man in your state of health should be more concerned about his daughter's future." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. "This is a notice of intent to file for water rights on the creek that runs behind your property. Without water access, this hotel becomes worthless." "You can't do that," Victoria protested. "That water serves the entire town. Mountain Valley Mining can and will control the watershed," Reed replied smugly. "Progress requires resources, Miss Lawson. Those who stand in its way get washed aside." Ethan stepped into the room then, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor. "Seems to me that's not how water rights work in Colorado territory," he said conversationally. "Prior appropriation doctrine, first in time, first in right, and I'd wager the Lawsons were using that creek long before your mining company showed up." Reed spun around, his face tightening when he recognized Ethan. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy." "Maybe not," Ethan agreed, "but I've been hired to break horses for Frank Daniels, which makes me a resident worker of this town. And I take exception to threats against my landlady." One of Reed's companions, a thick-necked man with a poorly concealed shoulder holster, took a step forward. "Boss want me to teach this saddle tramp some manners." Reed held up a hand. "Not here." His eyes never left Ethan's face. "Mr. Caldwell, is it? A piece of friendly advice: don't build a bunkhouse on shifting sand. The Lawsons' position in this town is precarious at best." He folded the document and returned it to his pocket. "We'll continue this discussion another time, when you're thinking more clearly, Mr. Lawson." After they departed, Victoria helped her father take a sip of water from a nearby glass. His hands shook badly, and Ethan could see the blue-tinged pallor beneath his skin that spoke of a failing heart. "Thank you for intervening," Mr. Lawson said, his voice stronger than his appearance suggested, "though I fear you've made yourself a target, young man." Ethan shrugged. "Wouldn't be the first time." "You know something about water rights," Victoria observed, studying him with new interest. "My father had a small spread in Kansas before I was born," Ethan admitted. "Lost it in a dispute with a cattle baron who dammed the creek. He talked about it sometimes when he'd been drinking." Mr. Lawson nodded thoughtfully. "Mountain Valley has been buying claims all through the territory. They're backed by Eastern money, lots of it, but they can't file on that creek without proving the water is being used for a beneficial purpose, and they haven't established any mining operations close enough yet." "They will," Victoria said grimly. "They're methodical. 3 businesses in town have sold to them in the past month alone." Why hold on to the hotel? Ethan asked. If they're offering good money. This is our home, Victoria interrupted. My father built it with his own hands when there was nothing in this valley but a few tents and big dreams. Everything I know about worth having is in these walls. The intensity in her voice stirred something in Ethan, an echo of a longing he'd buried years ago. What would it be like, he wondered, to care that deeply about a place? To have roots so strong that no amount of money could tempt you to cut them. We should let Mr. Caldwell get cleaned up for dinner, Mr. Lawson said gently. Victoria makes an excellent apple pie on Tuesdays. It was a dismissal, but a kind one. As Ethan turned to leave, Victoria touched his arm lightly. Stay for dinner, she said, please. It's the least we can offer after your help today. Ethan knew he should refuse. Getting involved in the Lawsons' problems contradicted his most fundamental rule of survival. Yet looking into Victoria's earnest face, he found himself nodding acceptance. I'll wash up and be down directly, he said, already knowing he was stepping onto a path that led away from the drifter's life he'd chosen. The next 2 weeks established a pattern that became increasingly comfortable. Ethan spent his days at the Daniels Ranch, breaking horses with a skill that impressed even the veteran hands. Evenings found him at the hotel, taking his meals in the dining room and often sitting with Victoria and her father afterward, listening to stories of the valley's early days. On the third Sunday, Victoria found him on the hotel's back porch cleaning his saddle. Church services are starting in an hour, she said, smoothing the skirt of her best dress, a deep green that brought out flecks of emerald in her blue eyes. Would you care to accompany us? Father feels strong enough to attend today. Ethan hesitated. He hadn't stepped foot in a church since his mother's funeral 15 years earlier. I'm not much for religion, he admitted. Victoria sat beside him on the porch step. It's not just about religion here, she explained. It's community. Everyone gathers, shares news, discusses problems. She glanced at him sideways. And I suspect we'll be discussing Mountain Valley mining today. They've put pressure on Reverend Foster to sell the church land. This new development concerned Ethan more than he wanted to admit. They're moving faster than I expected. Which is why we need everyone there who supports keeping Pinewood independent, Victoria said. Including our resident horse breaker. Ethan found himself drawn to the determination in her voice, the way she naturally included him in the community's struggle. It was a dangerous feeling for a man who had survived by avoiding entanglements. I don't have anything suitable to wear, he protested weakly. Victoria smiled, that dimple appearing in her cheek. You clean up just fine, Ethan Caldwell. Besides, God doesn't care about the cut of your coat. An hour later, Ethan found himself sitting in the small white clapboard church alongside Victoria and her father. The building was filled to capacity, with nearly 60 people packed into the pews. Reed and several other Mountain Valley representatives occupied the front row, their tailored suits standing out among the more practical attire of the townspeople. After the service, Reverend Foster called for anyone with community concerns to speak. Frank Daniels stood first. We all know why we're really here today, he said bluntly. Mountain Valley Mining is trying to buy up our town piece by piece. They've approached most of us with offers for our land. Some have sold. No judgment there. Each man has his reasons. But those of us who want to stay need to stand together, or there won't be a Pinewood left. Reed rose smoothly in response. Change is inevitable, friends. The silver in these mountains won't extract itself. Mountain Valley offers fair compensation and the promise of prosperity through employment. Fighting progress only delays the inevitable. The debate grew heated, with opinions divided. Some, like the blacksmith and general store owner, had already accepted offers. Others, particularly those with family roots in the valley, resisted. Throughout it all, Ethan observed Victoria's face, noting how each defection to the mining company's side caused her lips to tighten with disappointment. When the meeting finally adjourned, Reed approached them outside the church. Your reinforcements are having little effect, Miss Lawson, he said, nodding toward Ethan. The tide of public opinion is turning our way. The tide hasn't reached us yet, she replied coolly. Reed's smile was predatory. It will, and when it does, you'll find yourself stranded without support. He tipped his hat and moved away, stopping to speak with other townspeople as he went. He's right about one thing, Mr. Lawson said quietly as they walked back toward the hotel. We're losing ground. People are afraid to stand against the company's money and influence. Then we need to give them courage, Victoria replied. Show them it's possible to resist. Ethan remained silent, uncomfortable with how invested he felt in this community's struggle. He had broken all his Mustangs for Daniels. There was no reason for him to stay in Pinewood any longer. Yet the thought of riding away, of returning to his solitary existence, left a hollow feeling in his chest. That evening, as Victoria served coffee on the back porch, she asked the question Ethan had been dreading. "You've finished your work for Mr. Daniels," she said. "Will you be moving on now?" The cool evening air carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. In the distance, the snow-capped peaks glowed pink with the last rays of sunset. It was peaceful in a way Ethan had forgotten could exist. "I should," he admitted, but, Victoria prompted when he didn't continue. "I'm concerned about Reed's next move," Ethan said, which was true but incomplete. "He doesn't strike me as a man who accepts defeat gracefully." Victoria studied him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Is that the only reason you might stay?" The directness of her question demanded equal honesty. "No," Ethan said quietly. "It's not." The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Victoria's hand rested on the porch railing, inches from his own. It would be so easy to close that distance. Before he could, a horse thundered into the yard, its rider pulling up short at the porch steps. It was one of Daniel's ranch hands, his face streaked with soot. "Miss Lawson, there's a fire at the church." Everyone's needed to form a bucket line. They ran through town toward the column of smoke rising against the darkening sky. The church was fully engulfed, flames shooting from the windows and roof. A line of townspeople passed buckets from the nearby creek, but it was clear their efforts were futile. The building would be a total loss. Reverend Foster stood apart from the crowd, his face ashen as he watched his church burn. "It started so quickly," he told Ethan when questioned. "I had just locked up after putting away the hymnals when I smelled smoke. By the time I ran outside, the back wall was already burning." "Was anyone inside?" Victoria asked anxiously. "No, thank the Lord, but all our records, the church library, everything is gone." As they spoke, Reed appeared at the edge of the crowd, watching the destruction with an expression of studied concern. When he caught Ethan looking his direction, he smiled slightly and nodded, as if acknowledging a move in a chess game. "This is no accident," Ethan said under his breath. Victoria followed his gaze and stiffened. "You think Reed ordered this?" "I think it's a message," Ethan replied grimly. "A demonstration of what happens to those who stand against Mountain Valley mining." The fire burned well into the night. By morning, only the stone foundation and chimney remained of Pinewood's only church. The town gathered amid the smoldering ruins, shock and disbelief evident on every face. Reverend Foster called for calm. "This is a terrible loss, but buildings can be rebuilt. What matters is that we stand together as a community in this dark hour." "And who will pay for this rebuilding?" Reed asked, stepping forward. "The church's funds are limited, I understand." He removed his hat in a gesture of respect. "Mountain Valley Mining would be pleased to donate the lumber and materials necessary to construct a new church, at a different location, of course. The company has a suitable parcel closer to the proposed mine site." The crowd murmured at this offer. Ethan saw the calculation behind Reed's generosity. A church relocated near the mine would draw the town in that direction, making it easier to absorb. "That's very generous," Reverend Foster said cautiously. "But this land has been consecrated. Our congregation would prefer to rebuild here." Reed spread his hands in apparent regret. "I understand the sentiment, Reverend. However, I've just this morning received word that Mountain Valley has completed the purchase of this property from the Territorial Land Office. It seems there was some confusion about the original deed." The announcement hit like a physical blow. If the mining company could claim church land through legal maneuvering, no property in town was secure. "That's impossible, Mr. Lawson protested, stepping forward despite Victoria's restraining hand. "The church has held clear title since 1865. "Apparently not," Reed replied, producing a document from his coat. "The Territorial Office has recognized our claim based on a prior filing. These matters can be so complicated." His sympathetic tone didn't match the triumph in his eyes. As the crowd erupted in angry discussion, Ethan moved closer to Victoria. "This changes things," he said quietly. If they can challenge established deeds, the hotel could be next. I know, she replied, her voice tight with worry. Father's been reviewing our paperwork since Reed first approached us. He says our title is solid, but after this, she gestured toward the ruined church. That afternoon, a town meeting was called at the saloon, the only space large enough to accommodate everyone. Reed presented Mountain Valley's new proposal. The company would purchase all remaining private property in Pinewood at 20% above market value, construct a new town site near the mine, and guarantee employment for any residents who wished to stay. This is robbery disguised as charity, Frank Daniels objected. My family has ranched this valley for 3 generations. You can't just erase a town because it's inconvenient to your mining operations. Progress requires sacrifice, Mr. Daniels, Reed replied smoothly. And the reality is, Pinewood will not survive without the mine. The railroad has already agreed to route its new spur line to our facility rather than the existing town. Commerce will follow. The meeting descended into chaos, with neighbor arguing against neighbor. Some were ready to accept Reed's offer, others vowed to fight. Through it all, Ethan watched Victoria's face, seeing the determination there despite the odds mounting against her. When they finally returned to the hotel, exhausted and disheartened, Mr. Lawson suffered a serious episode. His breathing became labored, and his lips took on a bluish tinge that frightened Ethan. Get the doctor, Victoria instructed, her voice remarkably steady despite the fear in her eyes. Quickly. By the time Dr. Miller arrived, Mr. Lawson had been moved to his bed. The examination was thorough but brief. The heart is failing, Victoria, the doctor said gently when he emerged from the bedroom. The stress of today's events has accelerated his condition. He needs complete rest, no excitement, no business discussions. How long? She asked, her composure finally cracking. Impossible to say, weeks, perhaps months with proper care. He glanced at Ethan. She shouldn't be alone right now. After the doctor left, Victoria sat heavily in a chair, staring at nothing. I can't lose him in the hotel, she whispered. I can't. Ethan knelt before her, taking her hands in his. They were cold despite the warm evening. You won't, he promised. I'm staying, we'll figure this out together. The surprise in her eyes reminded him how unexpected his declaration was, perhaps to both of them. He had spent years avoiding commitment, avoiding connection, yet here he was, voluntarily tying himself to a failing hotel and its determined proprietress. Why? Victoria asked, searching his face. This isn't your fight, Ethan. He could have offered practical reasons, the injustice of Mountain Valley's tactics, the principle of the thing. But looking into her eyes, Ethan found himself speaking a deeper truth. Because for the first time since my father died, I've found something that matters more than moving on, he said quietly. Someone who makes me want to stay and fight. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Slowly, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, a gentle kiss that somehow felt more meaningful than any Ethan had known before. Thank you, she whispered against his mouth. That kiss changed everything. It acknowledged what had been growing between them since the day Ethan arrived in Pinewood, a connection neither had expected but both now recognized as precious. The next morning, Ethan rode to the county seat 30 miles away. The land office records confirmed his suspicions. Mountain Valley Mining had indeed filed claims on several properties in Pinewood, including the church land, based on obscure prior filings that had supposedly been discovered in territorial archives. Convenient timing, the clerk commented when Ethan pointed this out. Though not unusual these days, mining companies have friends in high places. What about the Lawson property? Ethan asked. The Pinewood Hotel. The clerk checked his ledgers. No filings against that one yet. But I'd keep a close eye if I were you. These companies are persistent. On the ride back to Pinewood, Ethan considered their options. Fighting the mining company through legal channels would be expensive and likely futile, given their apparent influence. Direct confrontation was risky with Mr. Lawson's health failing. There had to be another way. He found his answer in an unexpected place, the saloon. While stopping for a drink before returning to the hotel, Ethan overheard 2 mining company engineers discussing technical difficulties at their proposed shaft site. Reed's pushing too hard, one complained into his whiskey. That north ridge is unstable. We need more test borings before committing to a main shaft location. Tell that to the Boston investors, his companion replied. They want production started by fall. Ethan nursed his drink, considering this new information. If the mine site had engineering problems, it could change the equation entirely, but he needed more details. The opportunity came 3 days later, when one of the engineers, deep in his cups after a losing streak at poker, became loose-lipped with Ethan, who had positioned himself as a sympathetic ear. "The whole operation's being built on shaky ground," the man confided. "There's a fault line running right through the primary silver vein. Hit that wrong and you could flood the entire shaft system or cause a collapse." "Reed knows this?" Ethan asked casually. "Course he does, but the investors have already sunk too much money into the operation to back out now. So we're proceeding as if everything's fine." He drained his glass. "That's why he's so determined to get control of the entire valley. If the primary site fails, they need alternatives without having to negotiate new purchases." This revelation gave Ethan the leverage they needed. The next morning he shared his discovery with Victoria and her father, who had rallied enough to sit up in bed. If the Boston investors knew about the geological risks, they might reconsider their support, Mr. Lawson said thoughtfully. Or at least question Reed's rush to secure the valley. "Exactly," Ethan agreed, "but we need proof, something more substantial than a drunken engineer's confession." Victoria's eyes lit up. The survey maps. The mining company would have had to file detailed surveys with their claim applications. She turned to her father. "You still have friends at the territorial capital, don't you?" Mr. Lawson nodded. "Judge Harrison. We served together during the war. He might be willing to help us access the right records." "It's worth trying," Ethan said, "but we need to move quickly. Reed's not going to wait much longer before making his move on the hotel." The plan was set in motion. Victoria would stay with her father while Ethan traveled to Denver to meet with Judge Harrison and examine the mining company's filings. If they could find evidence that Mountain Valley had misrepresented the site's safety to investors, they might have the leverage needed to force Reed to back down. The night before Ethan's departure, Victoria found him on the back porch, staring at the stars. "What if this doesn't work?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in both of them. "What if we can't stop them?" Ethan turned to face her, taking in the worry that lined her forehead, the determination that still shone in her eyes despite everything. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that his drifting days were over. Whatever happened with the mining company, he couldn't leave her to face it alone. "Then we'll find another way," he promised, "together." She moved into his arms then, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. "I never expected you," she whispered against his chest. "When you rode into town, I thought you were just another drifter passing through." "I was," Ethan admitted, stroking her hair. "Or at least that's what I believed about myself." He tilted her face up to his. "You changed that, Tora. You made me want to be the kind of man who stays." Their kiss deepened, conveying all the emotions neither had fully expressed in words. When they finally broke apart, Victoria's eyes were bright with a mix of hope and determination. "Come back to me," she said simply. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Ethan promised. The journey to Denver took 3 days of hard riding. Judge Harrison, true to Mr. Lawson's assessment, proved sympathetic to their cause and arranged for Ethan to access the mining company's filings. What he discovered exceeded his hopes. The survey maps showed clear evidence of the fault line, yet the reports submitted to investors described the site as geologically sound with minimal risk factors. "This is misrepresentation, possibly fraud," Judge Harrison confirmed after reviewing the documents. "The investors have been misled about the viability of the primary mine site." Armed with certified copies of the relevant documents, Ethan rode back to Pinewood, pushing his horse harder than was wise. An urgent sense told him time was running short. He arrived to find his instincts had been correct. In his absence, Reed had escalated his tactics. A notice of eviction had been posted on the hotel door, claiming tax delinquency as justification. Victoria had been given 3 days to vacate the premises. "It's fabricated, of course," she told Ethan as they sat by her father's bedside. "Father paid the property taxes in January. But the receipt has mysteriously vanished from the county records." Mr. Lawson looked worse than when Ethan had left, his breathing more labored, his complexion grayer. "Did you find what we needed?" he asked weakly. Ethan produced the documents. "The mine site is unstable, just as we suspected, and Reed has deliberately concealed this fact from his investors." He outlined Judge Harrison's assessment of the legal implications. It's enough to force Reed to negotiate. Unless he simply denies everything, Victoria pointed out, it would be our word against his. Not quite, Ethan said. Judge Harrison has sent telegrams to several of the Boston investors, suggesting they might want to examine the geological reports more carefully. By now, Reed should be receiving some very concerned messages from his financial backers. As if summoned by their discussion, a knock sounded at the front door. Reed stood on the porch, his usual composure noticeably absent. Caldwell, he said tightly, I understand you've been to Denver. Come in, Mr. Reed, Ethan invited, ushering him into the lobby. We were just discussing your mining operations, geological challenges. Reed's expression confirmed that Ethan's strategy had hit its mark. Whatever you think you know. We know about the fault line, Victoria interrupted, joining them. And we know you've concealed it from your investors. Those reports are confidential company property, Reed snapped. You had no right. Public filings are available for public review, Ethan countered. Judge Harrison was quite helpful in that regard, as were the telegrams he sent to your Boston financiers. The blood drained from Reed's face. You've interfered with private business matters. The company will sue for damages. Before or after your investors withdraw their support, Victoria asked. I imagine they're rather concerned about putting their money into a mine that could collapse or flood at any moment. Reed's bluster gave way to calculation. He was, above all, a businessman. What do you want? The eviction notice withdrawn, Victoria said immediately, and clear title to our property guaranteed, with no further attempts to acquire it. That's not all, Ethan added. The church land returns to the congregation, and any other property in Pinewood obtained through manipulated records reverts to its original owners. Reed's jaw tightened. Impossible. The company has already invested. Your company can still build its mine, Victoria said. We're not opposed to progress, Mr. Reed. But it will be on fair terms, with Pinewood remaining an independent town, not a company property. The negotiation continued for hours, with Reed alternating between threats and conciliatory offers. Finally, as evening fell, a compromise was reached. Mountain Valley would retain its legitimate mining claims but withdraw all contested property filings. The town would remain independent, with guarantees against future encroachment. In exchange, Pinewood would not oppose the new railroad spur line, which would serve both the mine and the existing town. You've won a temporary reprieve, Reed said as he prepared to leave, but mining is the future of this territory. Sooner or later, towns like Pinewood either adapt or disappear. We'll adapt, Victoria assured him. But on our terms, not yours. After Reed departed, Victoria collapsed into a chair, the strain of the confrontation finally showing. Is it really over? She asked. For now, Ethan replied, kneeling beside her. Reed's right about one thing, change is coming to the West, but that doesn't mean we have to sacrifice what matters most. Victoria took his hand. And what matters most to you, Ethan Caldwell? Now that this fight is won. Ethan had spent years believing that attachment was a weakness, that the only safety lay in constant movement. Yet here, in this moment, he recognized the lie in that philosophy. True strength came not from isolation but from finding something, someone worth fighting for. You, he said simply, you and whatever future we might build together. In the fading light of evening, with the scent of pine drifting through the open window and the distant mountains standing guard over the valley, Ethan finally understood what his father had never learned. A man didn't need to keep moving to stay alive. Sometimes the bravest thing was to stop running and plant roots in fertile ground. I love you, Victoria Lawson, he said, the words strange yet right on his tongue. I rode into this town believing I was just passing through, but your smile, your courage, made me want to stay. Her answering smile, complete with that dimple he'd come to cherish, was worth every risk he'd taken. Then stay, Ethan. Stay and help me make Pinewood everything it can be. 3 weeks later, with summer blooming across the valley, Ethan and Victoria were married in the half-rebuilt church. Mr. Lawson, rallying briefly from his sickbed, gave the bride away. The entire town attended, even those who had initially supported the mining company. Reed was conspicuously absent, having been recalled to Boston to explain the geological concerns to increasingly nervous investors. That evening on the hotel's back porch, now their porch, Ethan held his wife close as they watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink. "I never thought I'd find a home again," he confessed. "After my father died, I convinced myself that staying in one place, caring about people, was too dangerous." Victoria leaned back against his chest, and now I know that the real danger was in never stopping long enough to discover what I truly wanted." He pressed a kiss to her temple. A home, a purpose, someone to build a life with. In the distance, the sound of hammers and saws carried from the church construction site. Pinewood was rebuilding, adapting to the changes that the mine would inevitably bring while preserving what made the town special. Much like Ethan himself had done, shedding the drifter's existence to become a husband, a community member, a man with roots and responsibilities. The transition wasn't always easy. Old habits of wariness died hard, but each day brought new certainty that he had made the right choice. "No regrets?" Victoria asked, turning in his arms to study his face. "Not one," Ethan replied truthfully. "I came to Pinewood thinking I was just passing through." He smiled, cupping her cheek gently. "But your smile made me want to stay, and now I can't imagine being anywhere else." As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, planning their future. The hotel improvements, the possible addition of a livery stable that Ethan would manage, the children they hoped would someday fill the rooms upstairs with laughter. The path ahead would have challenges, they both knew, but they would face them together. For a man who had spent years believing that survival meant never looking back, never forming attachments, it was a profound revelation. True freedom wasn't found in constant movement, but in having something so precious that all the wandering in the world couldn't compare to the joy of coming home. The cowboy who had just been passing through had finally found where he belonged.